Today we're going to continue our aim training crash course by covering smooth tracking, and I'm going to be teaching you the proper technique so you can track like a pro. If you're new here and looking at the video length, getting ready to click away, do what you want, but I promise you, YouTube is filled with videos talking about how you can become an aim god, but don't actually teach you anything about how to aim. My content actually arms you with the info you need to immediately act on and start improving with no filler or fake promises. As always, I'm going to be giving you recommended scenarios and routines in KovaaKs, FPS Aim Trainer. But don't worry if you don't want to shell out the 10 bucks for KovaaKs, we're going to be covering some aim lab tasks you can run as well, which is a free aim trainer. Make sure to check the description for timestamps and references. When it comes to sexy clips that people like to see, wide flicks and target switches are high up on the list. Tracking is kind of the unsung hero of aiming in FPS games because when executed well, it looks effortless. But make no mistake, it is a very difficult skill to master. I'm sure you've been in situations in FPS games where you just can't seem to hit your shots even when the enemy is moving in a predictable path. I know I have. Tracking is split into two main categories, reactive and smooth. In smooth tracking, our topic for today, you're primarily developing your ability to maximize your stability while keeping your crosshair on a target. Typically, this is on higher time to kill or TTK targets using guns with a high fire rate, but not always. This also includes your ability to react back to targets' changes in movement and quickly reacquire it to continue tracking it. But of course, targets in smooth tracking situations are more predictable, meaning they don't change direction and speed at a high frequency. So if you're doing the Voltaic or Riva Sec benchmarks, they'll be testing you on your ability to maximize what I call crosshair uptime, which is essentially how long you can keep your crosshair on a target while shooting it. Sounds easy, right? Well, maybe not. There's a lot of fine motor movement and mouse control required to keep your crosshair where you want it, and keeping it both smooth and stable. In FPS games themselves, this technique is super beneficial for minimizing bullet drop-off, so more of your bullets matter, eliminating targets more quickly, preferably before they kill you. It also makes better use of your inventory since you can effectively kill targets with less bullets. It becomes very apparent how useful smooth tracking is when using automatic guns in a mid-range or longer distance because targets become quite small and jitter along with recoil results in far more missed shots. Something that's important to understand is that smooth tracking is an underlying major technique, as important as clicking that you're developing. The foundation you're building here will apply majorly to other aim areas like evasive switching, dynamic clicking, and even static clicking, like when you're doing Pokeball scenarios. So don't skimp on developing the technique in favor of score chasing. For settings in your aim trainer, you'll be sticking with 103 Overwatch Field of View or FOV. There's no real advantage to setting it higher like there is in target switching. For backgrounds, it's better to use textures with lines, like concrete tiles and bricks are really popular at the moment. This helps you better understand bot movement and perceive depth. For sensitivity, you'll be running in your normal range. A good starting point is anywhere between 25 and 40 cm a rev. You don't want to go too low with your sens like you would with static because some of the smooth tracking scenarios like SmoothBot have a decent amount of velocity and angles. Back in the day, people would cheese the benchmarks like Thin Gauntlet with a super low sensitivity. That's not really possible anymore. Plus, the foundation you're building here will transition into more and more reactive tracking, which will have higher velocity targets and start to penalize you if you haven't built good technique, especially when reacting to bot direction changes. When practicing smooth tracking, it's often recommended to train at a higher sensitivity than you normally play with or are comfortable with. This increases the challenge, makes you create errors, which ultimately helps you improve faster. As a general rule, playing at a higher sens uses more of your wrist and fingertips, and a lower sens will use more of your shoulder and arm. When training smoothness, pay attention to which parts of your arm that you're using that result in jitter and adjust your sensitivity accordingly to focus on those areas. You can use a randomizer here with a significant benefit, almost as good as using one during reactive tracking scenarios. AimLab has a built-in randomizer. If you want to use one in KovaaKs, you'll need to use a third-party program, which I cover in another video. Word of caution, if you use a third-party tool, there is a chance you'll get banned just for having the driver installed it uses to randomize your sends, so use at your own risk. For technique, when you're starting out, one of the most important things to pay attention to is over-predicting. Over-predicting is basically when you're too focused on the bot patterns and start to preemptively react to target movement changes because you're anticipating them to change direction. What you want to always focus on while training is to assume that the bot will continue in its current direction forever, then wait until you see it change direction and react back to the movement change. That way you're developing your reading and reactivity skills. And while we're on the topic of reacting back to bot movement, it's very important to react back smoothly. By that I mean not flicking too hard and landing in front of the bot like you would in a flick target switching sen. Not only does this waste movement, it will cost you some habit unlearning later on when you move into more reactive tracking. You want your reaction to the target movement changes to feel smooth and relaxed, not tense and snappy.
On tension, KovaaKs is a top aimer who's going for Nova this year, and he asks I highlight this in smooth tracking, since this will have a major impact on your mouse stability. Tension refers to the force that you apply to your mouse when gripping it, and which muscles are activated will depend a lot on the sensitivity you're using. So you might not notice how tensely you're holding the mouse until you start using higher sensitivities, and become jittery because you're simply gripping the mouse too tensely. So while you're aim training, you want to consciously think about keeping your mouse hand as neutral as possible. A recommended technique is to rebind your mouse 1 to something else like spacebar, so you could feel what a completely neutral position is like in your mouse hand, and then always strive to attain that level of tension, consciously thinking about it when you're aim training. I've also heard people suggest visualizing that you're holding something extremely fragile, like an egg or very thin glass, so you subconsciously hold your mouse delicately because you're worried the thing you're holding will break. KovaaKs also suggests if you notice you're tensing in the middle of aim training, don't just restart the scenario, but actively think about relaxing the tension while you're playing the scenario. Over time, this will become more reflexive, meaning it's something that you'll do automatically. But especially at first, or when you're reviewing how to improve at smoothness, think about how tensely you are holding the mouse and how you can minimize it.
You also want to be watching the bot and not your crosshair pretty much always when doing smooth tracking. This is because you're partly developing your reading skills, which is essentially your ability to understand how a target is going to move on screen and react accordingly with your crosshair movement. Remember before how I mentioned crosshair uptime? Let's expand on that a bit. When you're training, you want to be prioritizing keeping your crosshair on the target even when it feels jittery. I see way too often players that are slightly in front of or behind the target and still following the same pattern and direction the bot moving, even though they're not doing damage to it. What you want to do is pay attention to when your crosshair falls off the bot and micro correct to bring it back. This is especially true in scenarios like Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, also known as PGTI, or Smooth Bot that have frequent velocity and angle changes. On the topic of resetting your mouse, due to the nature of smooth tracking sends, you're going to be encountering mouse resetting more than the other scenarios. By that we mean physically picking up your mouse to bring it back near the center of your pad when you run out of space. Resetting your mouse is not inherently bad. It happens, and learning how to properly reset your mouse quickly is a skill that you need to develop, because it will happen in firefights, and a good reset can mean the difference between winning and losing. There's two considerations here. One is try not to over reset just because you're on a part of your pad that you're not comfortable with. You want to get comfortable with parts of your pad, wrist, and arm that you aren't used to using. That's why you're aim training. The second is try to reset at a time when it is optimal, like when the bot pattern is the least viable. Remember when we talked about viability in other crash course videos? If not, make sure to go back and check those out. Basically, when the target is really difficult to hit anyways, like when its velocity is at its max or near the bottom of the arc with an arcing bot, that's when you want to prioritize resetting your mouse. That's pretty much it for technique with smoothness. This is a really straightforward mechanic that's difficult to master and just requires putting a lot of reps in. So to sum up, don't over predict. Assume the bot will keep going in its current direction forever, then react back when it changes direction. Pay attention to the bot and not the crosshair to build your reading skills. Focus on smoothly reacting back to bot changes. Prioritize crosshair uptime, micro-correcting when your crosshair falls off the target. Allow yourself to be comfortable with parts of your pad you're not used to, and focus on mouse resetting at optimal times.